Welcome to World Social Studies for elementary teachers. This is lecture J2 in Strategic Doctrine, talking about the doctrine of mutually assured destruction and other doctrines surrounding the use of nuclear weapons. This lecture examines how the countries of the world try to use nuclear weapons to achieve their security and the various strategies that they use to do that. After listening to this lecture, you should be able to complete the objectives listed on this slide. When I was an undergraduate, I took a course on national security doctrine. As part of that course, we traveled to an MX missile silo in Wyoming. As part of that tour, I saw the missile in its silo and the iconic command center with its pair of seats facing two key switches that, if turned simultaneously, would launch all 12 of the missiles in the silo farm into lower Earth orbit, which would then rain destruction on the Soviet Union. Each of the MX missiles had multiple warheads inside of it, so they would independently shoot out into a dozen different targets for each missile. The most surprising thing for me was that the skin of this missile, the outer shell, which cost tens of millions of dollars to build, was made out of wood. It turns out that a wood composite can hold its form under the stress and vibrations of a missile launch better than metal. Who knew? I would have never guessed that the missiles were made out of wood. During the Cold War, the threat of instant destruction from missiles such as these loomed over the world. This lecture will look at how that threat materialized and evolved, and how countries now use nuclear weapons to promote their national interest. Now, before we can talk about nuclear weapons as strategic doctrine, let's first clarify what that term means, strategic doctrine. We can differentiate strategic doctrine from tactical doctrine. Tactical doctrine is how you win a battle. So it's your military forces practicing their naval maneuvers, or perhaps drilling with their aircraft for how to take off and land, how to engage in dogfights. It might involve your infantry learning how to set up fire zones with intersecting machine gun ranges. These are tactics. They're knowing how to win a battle, how to gain an advantage over an opponent, how to use high ground, for example, where to place landmines to force the enemy into a kill zone. Those are all tactics, and it's tactical doctrine. Strategic doctrine is a step above that in abstraction. Instead of focusing on how to gain advantage and win a particular battle, strategic doctrine is how to fight and win the war itself, how to remove the ability of the enemy to fight. So an A-10 Warthog plane flying over the hill and blowing up a tank is a tactical bombing, but a B-52 Superfortress flying hundreds of miles behind enemy lines and blowing up a factory that makes ball bearings, that's a strategic bombing, because it removes the ability to continue fighting. It doesn't win the battle, but it makes it so that in the long run, the country that's attacked can't continue fighting. So that's the key difference between strategic battle, strategic doctrine, and tactical doctrine. Now, we could continue thinking in these terms and go one level of abstraction beyond strategic doctrine, which is not how do you win a war, but rather who are our enemies. And that's the grand strategy. A grand strategy is how do you align your country's capabilities in a way that secures your country's national interests. It's picking the overall stance of your military. It's who do you ally with? Who do you try to isolate diplomatically? That's what grand strategy is about. Our current grand strategy is preponderance, which is the idea that the United States will attempt to not only maintain the lead that it has over any and all peer competitors, but be so far in the lead that no power can hope to catch up to us. And in so doing, it will prevent them from even trying. And that is how we will secure peace and prevent a great power war. So that's the U.S. strategy of preponderance. Now, thinking in these terms then of winning a war versus winning a battle, nuclear weapons are the ultimate strategic weapons, because if you drop a nuclear bomb behind enemy lines and annihilate a population center or the industrial heartland of a country, given the massive destruction that I've described in the previous lecture, you'll see that it would sap the ability of an enemy to continue fighting, both in a material sense, but also in a psychological sense. They just don't want to continue the fight once they've had a nuclear weapon dropped on them. So as a result, nuclear weapons are the ultimate strategic weapon, and so those two terms of strategic weapons and strategic doctrine have in the modern era become synonymous with your nuclear weapons and your doctrine governing nuclear use. So when we talk about strategic doctrine, we're talking about the military doctrine for how do you use your nuclear weapons. That's also a political doctrine for what stance are you going to take with those weapons. There are a few dominant themes to U.S. foreign policy and history. I suggested in previous lectures on the national interest in foreign policy that one of these overarching themes was preventing the rise of a great power that could control the Eurasian landmass. So in the beginning of our country's history, the strategic doctrine, this is the pre-nuclear age obviously, was neutrality. That was our grand strategy, and it was also our strategic doctrine. We were a small country with few resources, at least in a military sense. And so the primary goal was to stay out of the great battles that were occurring between the competing powers of Europe as they sought to become the global and regional hegemon. We just didn't want to get caught up in that, because to do so would expend tremendous resources on our part and become a puppet of the winner would be the best we could hope for. So we tried to avoid becoming mired in that at all, and our official stance was that of neutrality. In fact, we fought undeclared war with the French over that, and we fought a declared war against the British over that principle. That was what the War of 1812 was about, was we insisted on being seen as neutral in the wars between England and France. So our strategic stance was we want to mind our own business and focus on our own internal conquest and development. Before World War II, after the country had become a great power in any meaningful sense, we still followed a policy of isolationism. We did not want to get mired into the competing and shifting alliances of the European great powers, and we wanted to continue focus on our own sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific. Now, this isolation strategy was not non-engagement. America has always been a nation that trades and is fully engaged in international affairs and international trade. But it was a policy of non-commitment. We did not have any set alliances with any power, and we did not seek any commitments from any power. We just wanted to do business with them. So that's what the doctrine was prior to World War II. Now, after World War II, everything changed. In the nuclear age, we abandoned our doctrine of isolation, and we begin a period where our strategic doctrine is determined by our stance on nuclear weapons. U.S. policy towards the use of nuclear weapons has changed over the years. This slide shows the development of that doctrine, and we'll deal with each of these specific doctrines in turn. Now, at the beginning of the Cold War, at the end of World War II, when the United States had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, President Truman offered the Baruch Plan, which was that nobody but the U.S. would get nukes, but we would help develop nuclear power for all. Now, opposition to this plan by the Russians was as immediate as it was predictable, as no nation has willingly disarmed itself in the face of a potential opponent's overwhelming power. So the Baruch Plan immediately failed. Truman then switched to the strategic doctrine of massive retaliation, which was that if the Russians moved even a single tank into Western Germany, then we would obliterate them by carpet bombing them with nuclear weapons. It was a threat of a completely disproportionate response. And if you recall the discussion of just war theory, you'll recognize that this doctrine does not meet that tenet at all. It violates a core tenet of just war theory. It's essentially an attempt to blackmail the Russians, to say that if you make even one misstep, we will annihilate you as a people. Now, this worked as long as the U.S. had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, or when the Russians only had a few. However, once the Russians developed the nuclear weapon and developed a means to deliver them, particularly once we thought they had a fleet of long-range bombers that were armed with nuclear weapons themselves, this doctrine is no longer an option, because you can't blackmail someone with annihilation if they can respond and annihilate you. The only way that threat works is if you can do a preemptive strike and eliminate all of their weapons before they're able to strike back. Now, that requires essentially perfect information, because if you miss even a few, then they're going to nuke New York and Washington, which is unacceptable. So you can't even miss a couple of the weapons. And you have to have so many weapons thrown at them that they can, even if they shoot some down, they'll still be annihilated. So the requirements to maintain massive retaliation, once the Russians had their own bomb, were just simply untenable. So President Eisenhower then turned to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This doctrine argued that if one side were attacked in a first strike, then it would have enough surviving nuclear weapons to deliver a deadly second strike. So the reasoning was that if a second strike was guaranteed, then no side had an incentive to launch a first strike. You would never start a war if you were guaranteed to lose. And that's what the idea of a survivable second strike was all about, is to convince the other side that no matter how badly they kill you, enough of your weapons will survive that you will kill them right back. Now, the advantage to this strategy is it reduced reliance on a disarming first strike. We didn't have to have an overwhelming amount of weapons to disarm somebody. And in fact, U.S. policy throughout most of the Cold War was to ride out a first strike, to make no effort to protect the country, but rather have our weapon systems be able to survive, even if the people did not. Because then, if we could ride out a first strike, we could then decide whether or not to shoot back. Now, this was not discussed in public, but it's what the force structure was designed around, that ability of having a guaranteed, survivable second strike. The way that was done was to develop the strategic triad. The strategic triad is the weapon systems that we had in order to convince the Russians that it was impossible to disarm us. So starting with the missiles on the left, missiles have the advantage of being able to fly across the continent, across the planet, to land anywhere on the planet we want them to, within about 40 minutes to an hour, depending on where on the planet they're aimed. When they're flying down, when they're re-entering the atmosphere, they're coming at tremendous speed, which makes them almost impossible to shoot down. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was impossible to shoot them down. And so the missiles were a great guaranteed hit. Now, the disadvantage to missiles is that they're based on land and they're permanent structures. And so the other side knows where all of your missile silos are, which means those missile silos are targeted by their own nuclear weapons. And in fact, most of our nuclear weapons were targeted at the Russian silos, so that if we shot, it would blow up their silos. And if they shot us, it would blow up our silos. The next leg of the triad is the bombers. And bombers have the advantage of being able to drop multiple payloads across several targets. They also have the advantage of not being stationary, so that as long as the bomber can get off the ground before the nuclear weapons strike, then you can't disarm them by shooting them on the ground like you can a missile. The disadvantage to bombers is that because they're aircraft, they can be shot down. And considerable effort was spent on both sides developing fighter aircraft capable of shooting down bombers. And for that reason, considerable expense was spent on the bombers to make them to be able to fly far and high and stealthily so that they could penetrate the airspace of the enemy and deliver their payload before they were shot down. The last leg of the triad was seen as the ace in the hole, because they were the best, the most survivable of the three forms, and those were the nuclear missiles on board submarines. The advantage to the submarines is that they would have a dozen or so missiles on board, and they could then just park somewhere in the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And these were nuclear submarines, so they did not need to refuel. They generated their own air and water, and so they could stay underwater for months at a time. And nobody knew where they were, not even our own country. The captain of the submarine had an area they were supposed to go, but the exact location was determined by the captain of the submarine. And so nobody knew where they were. And when they launched, they had enough weapons on board to create unacceptable damage to the other country. So even if the attacker was able to completely annihilate our missiles before they got off the ground and shoot down all of the bombers, they would still get shot at by the nuclear submarines. Nuclear submarines, because they're in the water, would also be shooting closer to their targets. Probably the missiles would not have to go all the way around the world like the ICBM missiles. And so they could strike within 20 minutes to a half hour, perhaps even less if the submarine was directly offshore. So the strike would be swift. Now, the disadvantage to submarines is because it's a craft, they can be attacked and sunk. And again, considerable effort was spent creating attack submarines who would track down and hunt the nuclear submarines. They were called boomers if they had missiles on board. So the idea was that you had, between all three of these types of weapon systems, you could guarantee the survivability of your nuclear force, that it was impossible to eliminate them, and therefore it would make no sense to start a war. So what MAD is all about is deterrence. It's preventing another state from attacking, from thinking about attacking. Now, deterrence is defined as preventing war through intimidation. The notion is that if your opponent is a rational actor, then you can convince him or her that the costs of fighting are too great. And this rational approach leads each side to present the strongest possible appearance to the other, because you're trying to convince them that war is simply unacceptable. The costs are too high. Ronald Reagan summed up this approach with the maxim that peace through strength is the approach we should take. Now, the advantage of this strategy is that if it works, war is avoided. Some argue that nuclear deterrence kept the peace between the two rival superpowers throughout the Cold War, when all other great power struggles of the past had led to major wars. Viewed this way, nuclear deterrence was a smashing success. Now, the disadvantage, though, is that you can never quite have enough weapons to present a sufficient deterrent. Efforts to pursue deterrence can lead to the security dilemma, which is as you increase your weapons, so does your opponent, leaving you less secure than when you began. The efforts by each side to reach parity or superiority in order to have the best possible deterrent often leads to an arms race. And so the disadvantage to the MAD doctrine was that it fed the arms race, because you have to have better and more weapons than your opponent in order to have enough surviving weapons to ensure a credible second strike. Now, the offense-defense competition has been around since antiquity. Swords led to armor. The presence of armor led to crossbows. So defenders built stone fortresses, which were countered by gunpowder and cannons. So likewise, the threat of nuclear weapons led to civil defense and air defenses, which led to a reliance on missiles that can't be intercepted with fighter aircraft. That led to an arms race to build more missiles and hardened silos, which in turn led to greater accuracy and multiple warhead missiles like the MIRVs in the MX system, which led to mobile missile systems like submarines and train-mounted launchers. So this offense-defense cycle eventually led to Reagan's SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative missile defense program, which would have led to even greater proliferation if the Cold War had continued. So this illustrates how deterrence is difficult to maintain. Now, the MAD doctrine was consistently the strategic doctrine throughout the Cold War, but it did have one modification in the early 1980s, and that was because there was a perceived problem of credibility. Now, remember, the whole point of MAD is that if you're attacked, you will respond with a like attack. And so if the Russians launch nuclear missiles on us, we'll launch nuclear missiles on them. Everybody dies. Nobody wins. Therefore, nobody has an incentive to start. But what would happen if the Russians attacked in a conventional way? Because they outnumbered us by 3 or 5 to 1 in most theaters that the Cold War was taking place. So let's say the Eastern European forces flooded into Germany, but there were no missiles launched. And the Russians took over Western Germany and said, okay, we're done. That's all we wanted. We're not going to attack France. We just wanted to unify Germany under our command, and so we're not going to attack anyone else. Well, what do you do as the American president? Do you follow a massive retaliation strategy and launch full-scale attack to the Russians, knowing that they'll shoot back and everybody dies? Probably not. Would you launch a single nuclear missile just to express your displeasure and risk a massive retaliation, killing everybody? Probably not. Would you use tactical nuclear weapons in Germany to try to offset the numerical superiority of the Warsaw Pact? Well, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. So the issue is, if there was a limited attack on our allies, would an American president jeopardize Chicago, New York, and Washington in order to respond to an attack on Dresden or Munich? And the argument was probably not. And that led to a credibility gap, because deterrence doesn't work unless the other side believes that the costs of war will be unacceptable. And so in the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, the U.S. doctrine shifted from a pure MAD to a flexible response. And the idea was that the United States and its allies needed to be prepared to fight the Eastern Bloc at whatever level they're attacked on. So there might be just conventional conflict. And so we had to develop a new generation of tanks and attack helicopters to be able to offset the numerical superiority of the Russians. So we sunk a lot of money into doing that. We then had to have some tactical nuclear weapons on hand, so that if the enemy launched one tactical weapon on us, we could respond with a tactical weapon and not have to launch an ICBM. But what happens if they were just to shoot missiles in one particular theater, like the European theater? Well, we would need to have the ability to respond just in the European theater. Again, not launching a full-scale response. Then there's the medium range. There's the notion of a limited exchange, where your battle plans have to be able to, when the president gives the order, just launch 3 missiles instead of having one order that is launch everything. So this was the idea of a flexible response, that whatever the attack came, we would meet that attack at that level. This was a very controversial doctrine at the time, because the critics argued that what it did was make war more possible, because as long as you're faced with 2 choices, no war or complete annihilation, neither side is going to really be willing to risk war. But once you've built into the sequence a war that doesn't involve complete annihilation, then the fear was that the politicians and generals would use that option, and they would attempt to engage in conventional war. They would attempt to use tactical nuclear weapons. They would start using theater nuclear weapons, because they would have tricked themselves into thinking that the war would stop there, when in reality, once a nuclear weapon was used, it would start both sides on the ladder of escalation, and they would move from tactical to theater to medium to a limited exchange to a full exchange. And you would end up annihilating the species when neither side wanted that. Both sides thought they were going to have just a regular war. So that was the criticism for flexible response. It was fairly controversial at the time, but the effect of flexible response was to dramatically increase the conventional capabilities of the Western Bloc. Many more naval ships were built, a whole new generation of tanks and helicopters and aircraft were deployed, and the tactical doctrines were modified to use those new weapons, which sets the stage for what we now think of as modern technological combat. In the 1970s, the 2 superpowers were able to figure out conditional cooperation, a way to reverse the arms race without undermining deterrence. The Cold War is a history of failed such agreements, but it's noteworthy that in the last 15 years of the Cold War, there were continuous negotiations over details, with the exception of a year after Reagan deployed Pershing missiles to Germany, which was part of the flexible response strategy, and the Russians walked away from the table for a year. And then 6 months after George Bush Sr. was elected, when Gorbachev was making unilateral concessions to end the Cold War, Bush withdrew his negotiators for 6 months. But other than those year and 6-month period, there was continuous negotiations between the Soviets and the Americans. The results of these near-continuous negotiations were the SALT I and SALT II treaties, which called for limited reductions in certain classes of weapons under limited verification measures. But real progress did not come until the Reagan-Gorbachev summits, which resulted in the INF Treaty, which was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, which banned medium-range missiles like the Pershing, and the START Treaty and the CFE Treaty. CFE is Conventional Forces in Europe, which is how the 2 sides drew down the number of troops, and ultimately the Russians completely withdrew their troops. So as the Soviet Union then imploded after these agreements, Bush and Yeltsin, who was the successor president of Russia, quickly concluded the START II Treaty, which had no real verification provisions, which reflected the development of trust between those 2 powers. And to bring the time frame completely up to speed, the Obama administration has just recently renegotiated the START Treaty, which is essentially the START III Treaty, but they're calling it like a rebooted START. And it is further reductions in nuclear weapons, but this time there are methods of verification involved, which the START II treaty did not have. So as we see and have seen through this lecture, the doctrines for using nuclear weapons has shifted over time, and even to this day are an important part of our foreign policy and our strategic stance for how these weapons are used in an effort to promote the country's national security. This presentation is provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.